Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. Today, very excited to have George Paulin, Senior Managing Director from Meridian Compensation Partners, and Don Kalfen, Partner, talking about the issue of special awards to executives. So we're going to be diving into a lot of interesting topics on this here today. And Don and George, welcome. And can you guys both give a quick, brief introduction to you?
Sure. Thank you. My name is Don Kalfen. I'm a partner of Meridian Compensation Partners. I have been with the firm since its founding, and I primarily focus on regulatory and governance issues.
Great. And George?
Thanks for inviting us. I recently joined Meridian from another firm where I was a senior person for a number of years, and I advise primarily board compensation committees of large public and private companies on executive compensation matters, and have done that for a number of years.
Great. Excited to dive in today. So let's kick off with the first question here. So focusing on CEOs and other proxy officers, what qualifies as a one-time special award, and are they a common thing?
Jake, let me answer it, or at least let me take the lead on it, and Don can supplement here what I'm saying. A special award. So executives get paid through a regular kind of direct compensation program. They get a salary, they get an annual bonus, short-term incentive, and they get long-term incentives. The long-term incentives in big public companies, small public companies, are generally equity related, okay? And there's a regular annual, so that's the program. And if you look at, the Fortune 500, the S&P 500, big companies, these programs, at least at the CEO level or at the level of executives in a proxy statement, are companies, and by the way, they're market-based. So you've got a regular, ongoing, market-based program that is substantial. A special award is where you go outside of the regular program and add something to it, generally on a one-time basis, and generally substantial. What's substantial? We track these, and Don and I have done a fair amount of research on this late, because it's a topic of shareholder interest, great shareholder interest, and therefore the boards are interested in it, and human resource management leaders. We look at $10 million or more in a one-time award on top of a regular competitive program as being substantial. So to get into our database, that's sort of a requirement, but it's our definition. So then you put some caveats on it. All right. Often companies will, in new hire packages, buy out forfeited compensation from the prior employer. And that can be substantial. They're buying out, they're making somebody whole for all the equity value that they're leaving on the table. All right. We don't count. That's not new. Sometimes, because you're getting your annual long-term incentives overlapping each year, companies will, for different strategic reasons, front load the annual grants into a big sort of one-time grant, and then average it out by making a commitment not to re-grant those amounts in the future years. If they do, we don't count that as a special award either. So what we're talking about is an on-top one-time grant over and above the regular program that's new on-top money.
Great. And Don, do you have anything to add to that?
Got to add a couple notes. Usually these type of awards are linked to specific milestones or events. George referred to monies paid up front to make incoming executives whole, but they also provide sign-on bonuses, many companies, in addition to make whole grants, as we refer to it. So these sign-on bonuses, which could be modest or which could be very large, would be the type of one-time award we'll be talking about, because that executive will also be eligible for the full range of executive pay that he otherwise would have been. The sign-on bonus is not in lieu of that. Other milestones that can generate one-time awards are promotions. When an internal individual executive is promoted to CEO, we see from time to time special awards in that case. And then there are extraordinary circumstances that the board believes that retention issues are very significant, and for a variety of reasons, they believe in order to ensure the retention of top executives, there's a need for a type of retention award. And all these comes in various shapes and forms, but usually they're not ad hoc. Well, they're ad hoc, but they're not gratuitous. They're usually linked to specific events.
That's great. And so do these special awards have any certain characteristics in terms of the amount, structure, or anything that really defines them as a special award?
Generically speaking, these awards may look like garden variety awards, but what makes them special is they're on top of the garden variety awards, and they have variable features. So there's not a uniformity among these awards, but size obviously is the most critical element, and most critical element evaluated by third parties. As George alluded to, in our database, we really start around $10 million, and we've seen awards as high as $100+ million in value. So there's a broad range. I believe in general, the award sizes have increased over the last several years. Then is what type of award is being used is typically equity, but we'll see cash awards as well, particularly on sign-on grants. We'll see cash retention that may be subject to service-based vesting. We'll primarily see the equity awards either in form of restricted stock units, which are time-based and less favored by third parties, or performance share units, which are more favored. And these require the executive to actually achieve certain performance objectives. Typically, these objectives will be over and above what's required with respect to the underlying arrangements. Otherwise, companies will be paying twice for the same thing. So those are the broad attributes. There are nuances between these type of awards that tend to be more company specific, but in general, these are the typical structures we see.
A couple of things. These special awards are not that common. Say on Pay started in 2013. We went back in the S&P 500 and tracked them based on the definition of $10 million or more. And from 2013 to 2020, which might be 2021 in some people's fiscal years, but we wanted to try to see what the Say on Pay experience was at companies that granted special awards. We found only 35, and most of those, the vast majority, I've got some notes on it. I think about half of them were $15 million or less. Another 30% or so were from 15 to 25 million. And then the other 20% or so were above 25 million. And as Don said, there are a couple that are in the $100 million range, but they're not a part of the ordinary compensation structure. The proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis, want as sort of a prerequisite that these are performance-based. And the idea is if it's on top pay, there ought to be on top performance. So goals are set high. You wouldn't earn it out for kind of target performance. You'd earn out 0 for target performance and then start earning out the special award for above target performance. But not all of them, when you look back, are performance-based. About half of them are either partly time-based restricted stock or options that are just vested based on time, and the other half are just pure performance shares. You earn out shares based on performance and start at 0 and earn out from 0 to 2 times or some multiple of the target number. So that's the typical characteristic. The amount that we put on this with threshold of 10 million is arbitrary on our part. And one other thing is that we did not include special awards at companies that have controlled ownership and are not really subject to the say on pay. They have say on pay voting in many cases, but the say on pay voting really isn't substantive in terms of the board accountability the way that it is at a non-controlled company. So we're looking at non-controlled companies in the Fortune 500 on that database of 35 that goes up to 2020. There are a number of them that were made, have been made in 2021 as well. Most recently, Jamie Dimon did this big stock option grant at JP Morgan. That hasn't been voted on yet in say on pay. We can't comment on what the shareholder reaction to it is. We can, tell you what we think it might be.
That's great. And so one question is, with all the challenges around say on pay with these special awards, why do companies make these special awards when they already have competitive ongoing pay programs?
Don hit on this already. Sometimes you go outside and you've got to attract a new, we're talking about CEOs. You go outside to recruit a new CEO, and this is a star system. So often there's an inducement to get someone to come to the company. You pay ongoing competitive regular compensation, what I described at the beginning, a salary and an annual bonus and annual long-term incentives. You buy out the money that's being left on the table. Both of those are customary. So the ongoing compensation generally, so you don't disrupt the internal equitability of your ongoing pay program, is competitive with the way that you pay people. You pay everybody else. You can't pay one person at the 90th percentile of the market and everybody else at the 50th percentile of the market without a concern. So usually you have to fit that into your competitive program. The buyout is a make whole. You're no better off or worse off than you were before. We're paying you competitively. We made you whole. What else do we have to do in addition to that as an inducement to get you to come? And so that's one form of special award. Recognition for promotions. The president becomes the CEO. You want the person to have a significant kind of skin in the game in the executive compensation program. Recognize the importance of the promotion. So that's another thing. Retention is a very competitive labor market, and in some industries, extremely competitive. You have someone in the job that you want to stay in the job for a longer period of time than he or she may think is appropriate to stay. So you put a vesting of a big grant out at the end of some period that you want to keep them for in your succession planning. And other events, M&A to support a major strategic initiative, that transformational stuff like in the entertainment business, moving from regular TV to streaming, financial services, all kinds of examples of that type of thing. Some of them are event driven, promotion, M&A, strategic initiatives. Some of them are retention related. Some of them are just related to strategic planning considerations and retaining the person coming up and the person going out for critical periods of time, all of those reasons. And if they're performance based, they being the special awards, and they're on top performance, on top pay, you get the pay delivery alignment that you're looking for if the performance goals are achieved.
Great. And so what would you guys say is the general experience with proxy advisors and the big investment funds with say on pay voting and all these special awards?
It has certainly evolved over the years. Back when say and pay started, early part of last decade, I think there was general acceptance of these type of awards, one-time awards. We weren't seeing significant impact on say and pay outcomes. We weren't seeing significant adverse vote recommendations by ISS or Glass Lewis or institutional investors pushing back on these type of awards. And that could be for several reasons. One, due to their novelty, terribly prevalent, and the size of the awards were relatively modest back in the early days. But that has evolved and changed significantly fairly recently over the last few years. We are seeing ISS being much more aggressive regarding one-time awards and often recommending against a company's say and pay proposal, if not primarily, but in large part due to these one-time awards. Similarly, we've seen movement among institutional investors. Both Vanguard and BlackRock have updated their proxy voting policy that takes, frankly, a rather dim view of these type of awards. They don't prohibit them. ISS doesn't prohibit them, but they're coming under much sharper scrutiny. And unless the stars align, Vanguards of the world and BlackRocks of the world will likely vote against a company's say and pay proposal, and ISS will likely recommend against a company's say and pay proposal if the one-time awards do not have significant rationale that's disclosed, significant purpose, why it's needed over and above the garden variety compensation that the executives earn. And of course, it needs to be performance. And we believe not only is there a statistical correlation between one-time awards and adverse say and pay voting results, we believe it's clearly a causation relationship as well. Because when we examined the 35 awards that George alluded to and looked at the most recent awards over the last couple of years, we looked at year one, the year when the proxy first revealed these one-time awards, and there was a vote. And either the vote was suppressed, meaning shareholder support was unusually low, or in fact, upwards of 6 companies failed say and pay. And then when we looked at the next year's say and pay vote results, they were back up in the normative range. And it's hard to explain that other than through the fact that the one-time pay award had an outsized effect on say and pay voting.
So if you look at some of those numbers that Don was alluding to and get under the hood, 35 broke down in the vote. All right. Now, say is an advisory vote of the shareholders. And a rule of thumb has developed over the years that anything below 70%, meaning 30% of the shareholders voting against the program, is a bad outcome. One where you've got to take remedial action the next year, or you're expected to based on the shareholder feedback. Less than 50%, you failed. Okay, that's simple enough. Of the 35, are 6, which is about 17%, failed. Less than 50. Another 10, which is about 30%, were between 50 and 70. So they didn't fail, but they didn't get an acceptable result. And the other 54%, I guess, if you're adding this up, got greater than 70%. Essentially, the rationale, the structure, the size, all of the considerations that go into the shareholder voting decision, how you get to that is another issue. We'll talk about that, but that was the experience. All right. Now, if you break that down by size, it's logical. The bigger the award, the more likely it was to the more opposition. All right. There were six that failed, and of the 6 that failed, 5 of the 6 were $25 million or more. One was smaller, but at a company that had pretty challenged performance at the time the award was made. So the size makes a difference. The structure of the award, surprisingly enough, doesn't really correlate with the voting outcome. About the same percentages of approval, at least going back in history, apply to the performance-based versus the time-based versus the ones that are combined. But when the award was made is significant here. ISS and Glass Lewis, I think consistently since the beginning of Say on Pay, since the beginning of Say on Pay, were pretty consistent about their position, stay with the regular program. Don't go outside of the regular program unless you've got a really compelling and rarely would we expect it to reoccur a situation. The big investment funds, often in the early years, the Vanguards, the Fidelities, the BlackRocks, if you went to them in direct engagement and had a strong rationale for going outside the regular program, and you could get approval. And we've actually looked back at who voted for and who voted against these things, and it's interesting. But there was a sea change around, 2019 that seems to be a very different tone, much more negative climate. For example, of the 35 that we observed, ISS recommended against 18. 12 of the 18 were 2019 and 2020. So that's 2/3 of their negative recommendations on these special grants. Their policy was amended, I think, in 18, 19, 20, something like that, to be applicable to 19 or 20. BlackRock, same thing. Glass Lewis tightened up on its policy definition regarding special awards at that time. It's harder to get one approved now than it was in the earlier years that affect the numbers that you see when you go back this far. You got to overlay that experience with the time and the data, but it's pretty significant.
Great, Don. Anything to add on to that?
I think we did a comprehensive overview at this point.
Okay.
That matter?
All right. So what advice do you guys have on how to secure the best Say on Pay results when the board believes that a special award is necessary?
Let me start. Number one, be careful. So make sure that it is necessary and have a good rationale. And just plain retention is not necessarily a strong rationale. The shareholders are smart. They know that if there's really a great performer or candidate, you give them the extra money and someone will buy it out. And that happens consistently. So what you're doing is making somebody more wealthy. They're going to get the money if they stay, and they're going to get the money if they go. So the retention argument is a little bit weakened by that. Same thing when you're doing this in the form of succession planning. We want somebody to stay another 5 years. You didn't do a good job of succession planning if you've got to pay someone more than a competitive amount to get them to stay longer. Other person should have been ready to take over, and the transition should have been more natural. M&A, promotions, new hires, again, within reasonability would be considered. What's reasonable? The amount is important. Once you get past 15 million and into the 25 million and above range, there's high risk of opposition. I think the more performance-based and the more on-top performance for on-top pay and being able to demonstrate that with, hey, look, this person makes an extra, I don't know, take a big number, $100 million. And the shareholders, $5 billion. We really need to focus on this. And it's a win-win. And you can present it that way, you're going to be successful. When I say present it that way, these things are not just write about it in the proxy after you. These have to be socialized ahead of time. Generally, someone from the board compensation committee or the chair or together go to the big shareholders and engage with them directly about the rationale, the need for this, and the structure, how we arrived at this amount, what's the performance, how do the shareholders benefit, what's the pay delivery going to be to establish the fair, what I call win-win nature. You do that, you have the ability to do that, and you got a good shot at, I think, at getting it done.
I guess I'd have a few items, although George covered most of the ocean front on this. Just to reemphasize a couple of his points, companies have to go strong with shareholder engagement. They can't just look at their top 2, 3 institutional shareholders. They got to get pretty far down the list. It may not cover 50% of the voting shares, but it needs to cover a good portion of the outstanding voting shares. And this should be led, as George mentioned, by senior personnel of the company, senior management, to get feedback from the shareholders and setting the performance metrics. That's another very tricky area. As I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be redundant with what's in the existing performance award structure. These should be for really extraordinary achievement over and above what's expected under the normal plan to help justify the reason for the award. And lastly, I would say you have to moderate your expectations. Whether you can get through or not, there's still not a certainty. And ISS is going to be increasingly harder to corral ISS on this. I think the default now is to vote against unless convinced otherwise. Very hard to do. That would only come through disclosure as opposed to any type of one-on-one discussion with ISS. And if ISS votes no, there is a strong correlation between even some of the largest mutual funds and independent investors who have their own proxy voting guidelines still vote oftentimes in lockstep at high levels with ISS. So ISS can't be ignored in this equation, but companies can't really co-opt them either. They're going to determine their vote recommendation independently. And really, that's really the last item that needs to be considered. What will ISS do and how that impacts the institutional investors of a given company.
Just to pile onto that one for a minute, when I talk about this with clients, I generally tell them to just assume that ISS is going to recommend against them in say on pay if they make a substantial 10 million or more special award. Just assume they're going to recommend against you and assume that Glass Lewis is going to recommend against you. And so if you think you can get 70% or more on say on pay, you're going to have to do it through direct engagement and separate the big investment funds who are represented in your company from the proxy advisor recommendations. And that can be done with a good rationale and the right quantum and the structure, but it's hard. And the say on pay risk is high. The 50 to 70%, that's fine. There's some issues about what are the teeth in say on pay? Do you really care if you passed and you got less than 70%? You go back and make some concessions for the next year. And if it's important enough to some companies will decide that they'll fight for it on that basis. Others, as you see from some of these recent failures that are big, well-known companies where they've had say on pay failure in the last, primarily because of some form of special award, Starbucks, Walgreens, General Electric, IBM, others, that it just shows that it's increasingly difficult.
That's great. I appreciate you guys taking the time to come on here and share all of this with us. Are there any other final parting words that you'd like to share before we wrap up here?
I think we're good.
Yeah, I think we covered it.
All right, perfect. Thank you guys for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.
Okay. Thanks a lot.